Hey, what's going on? Back at it to give you another recap, this time in round 2 of the 2026 Fide Candidates Tournament for both the open and women's sections. And straight up, there was a lot of James Hardening today. There was a lot of Joel Embiiding today. There was some Shea Gilgeous-Alexandering today. There was a lot of world peace today. And I say all those things because if you're a basketball head like I am, you know there was a lot of drawing today. There was a lot of those folks draw fouls, and in this event today we had a lot of peaceful results. That's right, all 8 games, the 4 in the open and the 4 in the women's section, were drawn. And not all draws are created equal, so we're going to take a dive into each one and see what was really going on. But some of them I could kind of do without. And then some of them, there were some highlights. So let's dig in. We'll start with this position from the open section between Wei Yi with white and Prague with black. If you recall, Prague won a really nice game in the first round with white in the Grand Prix attack against Anish Giri, and Wei Yi made a nice solid draw with black against Blue Bomb. In this game, Wei Yi has the white pieces, and this is a French position on the board. A rare choice from Prague, but one that actually shows some ambition. And one of his countrymen, Arjun Erigaisi, is known to play a number of Frenches, so maybe that featured in his decision. Wei Yi is a very strong player, very solid, and so I could see how Prague wanted to maybe get him a little bit out of his comfort zone, and he actually managed to do that because in this position, Wei Yi made a pretty important mistake, I would say, and it's very rare that castling is actually a mistake, but in this position, castles is a mistake, and the best move actually is d takes c5. Part of the reason for that is that the knight and the bishop then have this square, this potential outpost for their pieces. The other reason is when the pawn is captured, you can actually consider castling queenside, whereas if you castle queenside and the tension still exists, c4 is very, very dangerous because now the center is closed and the pawn storm with b5, b4 is really, really quick. The other thing that Wei Yi had to consider is in some positions you can actually greet gifts. So there's sometimes something like bishop takes h7 can be dangerous, and then knight g5, but not here, because the queen can't easily get around. But there are some positions where a move like h4 might factor in, and then sometimes bishop takes h7, knight g5 check. If the h file opens up, sometimes dangerous things can happen. None of that happened in this game, though, because after castles, Prague played f6, and this is a really nice move undermining the center. He was still in his preparation, and after e takes f6, knight takes f6, king h1, it really is another kind of passive move where you're not really doing very much in the center, and black has this opportunity to play c4, close the center, bring the bishop off of this long diagonal, and then keep pushing with b5, b4. This actually presented itself as an opportunity on the next few moves as well, because b6 happened, knight e5, queen c7, rook a e1, bishop d6, knight takes 6, queen takes e6, and again after bishop e2, again c4 is the best move, and then it's actually remarkably hard to stop this b5, b4 plan in a really nice way. If the knight on c3 is kicked, this knight can get this wonderful outpost on e4, and this bishop on e3 is kind of a fat pawn. Doesn't have any mobility whatsoever. The e6 pawn, which is technically the backward pawn in the structure, has no pressure against it because these bishops are in the way, and it's just not a great position. Instead, black decided to play rook a7, which is not a bad move. It's actually a good move. I'm trying to get the rook in the game, but the time spent to play rook a7 and rook f7 actually allowed white the opportunity to play f5. And this is a move that's impossible if the pawn is on c4, because then there wouldn't be the same level of pressure on d5. The point is in this position after f5, if e takes f5, white has d takes c5, and you can see the queen, the knight, and the bishop all putting pressure on the d5 pawn. So again, if c4 was played in one of the last few moves, let's say here, bishop f3, f5 is not really a good move at all. Let's say there's another developing move like b5, let's say f5, after e takes f5, there's no d takes c5, and and helping the queen get in on that and gang up on the d5 pawn as well. So there's just nothing there. So because of that indecision with c4 not being played by Prague, what you had is you had Wei shuffle his pieces around, play the f5 break. He spent oodles and noodles of time here. You can see he's almost an hour down on the clock, but it was indeed time well spent, because after f5, the position essentially petered out. There were some more exchanges, and we essentially got an obstacle at bishop endgame, which is completely drawn, even a pawn down. Big difference from yesterday and today is there are no clear pass pawns, and the bishop can blockade the majority on the queen side really easily. And you see that happen here. The bishop blockades a5 and b4. This majority isn't going anywhere. And then the kings just oppose each other on the king side. And this is a dead draw, even though black is a pawn up. Very different than the Hikaru Fabiano bishop and queen endgame that we saw for extended periods yesterday. So dead draw on this one. An interesting moment with c4. That was an opportunity, but Prague didn't really go for it and missed his chance in that position to get more pressure. Next game, there's a game between Javikir Sindarov with white against Matthias Bluebom with black. If you recall, Sindarov won a nice game with white towards the end against Andrei Yesipenko, and Bluebom drew the aforementioned Wei E with white. In this one, we have a Petrov. This is a very symmetrical structure here, and the Petrov is a really good weapon with black at the top level to kind of neutralize things. Black is not playing to win this game at all. Black was playing to draw and hold against a very ferocious attacking player. And we have a little bit of an imbalance here after king c7, knight f5, and bishop takes f5. And after bishop takes f5, bishop takes f5, g6, white has the bishop pair. And the question is the bishop pair going to actually cause any problems in this pretty symmetrical position? As we said, the pawn structure on the queen side is completely symmetrical. The pawn structure on the king side is a little bit unbalanced with this double G pawns. The hope for white is that one of these breaks, either f4, f5, or g4, could make some inroads to kind of open up the position for the rooks and then the bishops that are pointing towards the king side. The problem of these double pawns is that they're on dark squares where it's pretty easy for the knight on e6 and the bishop on f8 that could go to e7 to pressure it. So it's very hard to continue to advance while also not just straight up losing the g5 pawn. And Sindarov did not manage. So we had a few more moves. The bishop came out, more pieces came out. f4 was played. Again, you're looking at f5 one day on a good day, but Bluebom covers that square with knight g7. Great move, defending f5. We had one pair of rooks traded, g4 was played, and then probably the highlight of the game in terms of the defense was f5, a nice move, essentially saying, yeah, you're trying to get open on the h file with the rook, but we're going to block this diagonal with the pawn here, and so the bishop can't really get through at all. It's like almost like a Lord of the Rings, you shall not pass type of thing. And, well, after that, the game is pretty gridlocked. The bishop pair is pretty irrelevant here because the bishop on c2 has no scope, and the bishop on d2 is defending f4. You might say, well, you can open it up on the queen side potentially. You could play bishop b3 and c4, but as soon as you play bishop b3, black might play b5. And honestly, if you go for that break, the d4 pawn could be a target. So nothing really interesting happened the rest of this game. There was a little temporary piece sacrifice, which resulted in ultimately a trade of the bishop for knight, and then there was a repetition, and that was draw number 2 in the open section. All right, next game was between Anish Giri and Fabiano Caruana. Anish did lose in round 1 in a very tough game against Prague, and Fabiano, we know, won this really nice, well, it was poor technique, but wildly entertaining game against Hikaru Nakamura. And in this one, I think Anish was trying to settle things. He opted for, relatively calm, Catalan-style setup. And Fabiano was actually the first to surprise because he played the move knight d7. Very, very rare to see knight d7 this early in a queen's gambit. You'll play knight f6 first, That's really the main move you'd see in most of these structures. But knight d7 was played, and apparently Anish wasn't surprised because he played g3 pretty quickly, going for a Catalan-style setup where you get the bishop on the long diagonal. And essentially we got a position where after d takes e4, rook b8, another kind of surprise, moving the rook out the way of this diagonal pretty quickly, threatening to reinforce the c4 pawn with b5. An interesting way to play, no doubt. Anish stopped that by playing a4. Fabiano went b6, and we had a very fresh position on the board where after bishop b4 check, bishop d2, very concretely, there's bishop takes a3. And white gives up, black gives up the bishop pair to get the pieces out. And then another weird move, knight e7, still prep from Fabiano. And essentially we got a position where a lot of pawns get traded, and white has the bishop pair, but it doesn't really count for very much. And we essentially had a position where a lot of pieces were traded, the rooks were contested on the d-file, more trades, the king came to the center to kind of stop the white rook from invading completely and dominating the d-file. The king came to the center, then the rook challenged the d-file, and this was probably the only interesting moment for the audience at home watching. The point is that rook takes b6, which looks like a free pawn, is not actually that great because after rook d1 check, bishop f1, knight e4, this is going to be a free piece because of the pin. And if you go king g2, knight d2 still is trapping that bishop on f1. White is not losing here. You can give a check on b7. And the point is the king has to guard the d7 square because if you go king f6, rook d1 is a pin that prevents black from winning a piece outright. Black could still play rook takes f1, rook takes d2, but after rook b1, this pawn is hanging. There's no way to defend it, and it's just a draw. So after this rook d8 move, Anish instead decided to play f4, give the king an escape square. So after rook d1 check, the king go to f2, and then there was another repetition, and that was draw number 3. Last draw was a game between Andrei Yesipenko and Hikaru Nakamura. Again, Hikaru lost yesterday trying to recover. So did Andrei. So both folks are trying to get points on the board. And white is a little better in this position. Why? These pawns on the queen side are split. The white's pawns are together. And that gives white some chances in an endgame. As pieces get traded, there might be some more pressure on the pawns. And so what happened is white tried to do that, played queen c3, trying to trade the queens. There was a bit of a shuffle here, and knight d2. And really, I thought that knight d2 already was a sign that black was probably going to hold the game. Because a lot of times when there are these weak pawns, you actually want to attack the pawns, not blockade them. And I could see with knight d2, Andrei was trying to put a knight on c4 and kind of blockade the square a little bit. But a lot of times when you blockade the square, instead of attacking the square, it's almost like isolated pawn type of position. You give black activity around the isolated pawn that make it not a big concern. And that's kind of what happened. So we had some play on the c-file, blockading the pawn. Black plays around the IQP, not straight up defending it. That would be passive, but plays around it. And then eventually with e5, black's trying to get a foothold on the d4 square. There was some more trades, some activity. This rook went passive for a moment, but in a few moves, or more than a few, essentially black gave that pawn up to be active. And eventually I'm flicking through this really quickly because we got to a pawn down rook ending, but it's going to be a draw with the best play because the rook is in front of the pawn. That's not the ideal setup. You really want the rook behind the pawn. If this white rook was on a1, white would be winning. But the problem is when you have the rook in front of the pawn, it's hard to shuttle it up the board because at some point the rook will get stuck. And the black rook can get behind it and guard it very easily. And if the white king comes to support the pawn, then black will just give a ton of checks from behind. So that's kind of what can happen in these type of positions. And unfortunately for white, if white really makes a run for it, they might just lose their whole king side. So the white king stayed kind of passive. There were some checks. The king decided to go active, but it's a futile exercise. And you can see the rook is behind the pawn easily. There aren't enough pawns here to really do anything. And the game was actually a agreed draw here because if black plays g5, the last pawns get traded. Takes, takes, takes. And this king will just shuttle this way. This king will take on f5. And the a pawn will be easily corralled. One thing you might say, well, what if h5, trying to keep pawns on the board so that this king can take here? Well, that would be sharp and interesting, but now black has a very dangerous pawn, and now this pawn would be the most dangerous one on the board, and you're basically inviting losing chances as white if you go for this, so doesn't make any sense. So both players got on the board, got that draw, and that was 4 draws in the open section. On to the women. This position between Bibisara and Gorechkina looks really interesting, looks dynamic. There's a king on f8. There's a king on e1 that's not castled. There's imbalance in the pawn structure. There's a pawn taken here on a2. White has a majority on the king side in the center. But here's the thing. This position has been played before. And I knew it was played before actually while it was going on because there was a game that Arjun Erigaisi, I believe, played with white in this position in a really nice game. I don't know who the black player is, but Arjun won a nice game on the white side of this position. I think it was against Yakoboyev, if I remember correctly, but it was definitely against one of the Uzbek guys. And essentially, this is just a kind of computer-generated position where white can get a little bit of pressure, but not enough. And the game just peters out. So essentially, you play queen d2, defend the b2 pawn. There's some check here. There's some more maneuvering. It looks like white is about to castle and be scot-free, but the problem is this pin is really annoying. So you play f6 to not allow e5, and then the king goes to e7, and all of a sudden, how do you deal with this pin? Well, you have to play e5, but then the queen interposes, and we're going to get the queens off. There's going to be a liquidation here. There are more trades. There are more trades. And white is a pawn up temporarily, but it's pretty symbolic given that the b2 pawn is essentially a goner. And this is what happened. And so we get a rook ending that is completely drawn. And yeah, they got to move 40 and actually agreed. So not really a nothing burger here, really a theory battle. Both sides are really well prepared. And that's sometimes what chess is at this level. Next game was a game between Anna Muzichuk and Tan Zhongyi. Yeah, they both had draws yesterday, so, trying to kind of keep the game going today. But I've seen this position before as well. And, if you're a strong player, eventually you wind up seeing these pawn structures and you can just guess what the opening is based on the pawn structure. And I looked at this right away and was like, Petrov. Why? Because typically in the Petrov, you have a very symmetrical pawn structure across the board. And it's really the piece configuration. The knight on c6 in front of the c-pawn with this type of structure is a Petrov type of thing. These split pawns means there were double c-pawns. And what that means is when they're double c-pawns, it usually means there was a knight takes c3 at some point, which is a feature of the Petrov. And this is what the position was. There were a host of exchanges. Bishop f6 is a nice move, taking advantage of this pin on d3. The knight is not hanging. Knight got to e5. There were some more trades, and before you knew it, a repetition ensued. And again, essentially a nothing burger, and that's where we were in this one. Now, on to the good stuff. There are the last 2 games I'm going to show in the women's section actually were very, very entertaining in moments for different reasons. And we're going to start with this one between Vaishali and Divya Deshmukh. Divya Deshmukh is white and Vaishali is black. And in this position, we have a Carlsbad structure. White has a king side pawn majority and black has a queen side pawn majority. You can see white is trying to pressure the base of this pawn chain on b7. But normally in these Carlsbad structures, if you get a knight on d6, you have a very, very satisfactory position. And it's because this knight on d6 defends the b7 pawn, controls the e4 break, can potentially go to f5, sometimes go to c4, and even in some cases go to b5. And so that knight is perfectly placed to kind of cover all of the points of attack in the position. That being said, white has a little bit of pressure because this king is a little airy. The knight on c5 is a little bit annoying, pressuring the b7 pawn, kind of close to the king. And it is a kind of nervy position. And we're before move 40. This was actually move 34. And you can see both players are under 3 minutes. So that's pretty much the definition of time trouble. And in this time trouble, Vaishali played an unthinkable move. The last few moves she'd been playing queen d8, queen e7, queen c7, just kind of repeating moves, keeping the status quo. And she panicked and played the move knight e4. And you could see that eval jump very wildly to almost +2. And the reason for that is all of a sudden the b7 pawn is hanging. And so you might say, well, isn't it a trade? Isn't you trading the b7 pawn, but you can maybe recapture on c5 and get that pawn? The answer is no, because there's pressure on the f7 pawn too, and there's potential checkmate threats. So after rook takes b7, rook takes b7, rook takes b7, there's no time for knight takes c5 because queen f7 isn't checkmate in 2. This is over. This is queen g7 is mate. So scary hours, very dangerous time. And after rook takes b7, Vaishali found the only way, after rook takes 7 here, the only way to try to fight, which was knight g5. And knight g5 is a nice move. It attacks the queen. It challenges it defends the pawn f7. And now it looks like you're threatening rook takes c5. And so if the queen moves to any kind of passive square, now black is winning because rook takes c5. That knight was protecting the rook on b7, and then you just pick up the rook on b7 and you're piece up. The problem is that white can play the very savvy move queen g4. And queen g4 is a nice move because now the queen is hitting its counterpart on c8. So there's no way you could play rook takes c5 because the queen's hanging. And if you trade queens, now the extra pawn is protected. The rook is still bearing down f7. This knight can't even come back to help right away because knight takes e6 is a pin. And white is actually totally winning here. Now, if we go back for a moment, just to point out, before this knight e4 move was played, black should have probably played queen c7 and just chilled. But that's tough to do when you're in time trouble. Now, going to this moment, so knight g5, I'm saying queen g4 is the best move. Divya, in time trouble, again, she has 50 seconds for 3 moves. She played the move queen g3. And this move looks winning because white looks like they have a way in with queen e5 check and rook b8 going for a checkmate pattern on h8 or winning the queen when the king is forced to step away. Unfortunately for Divya, what ensued is one of the more beautiful defensive sequences you'll see. So rook takes e5 was played. Queen e5 check was there. Now again, if the king goes to g8, there's rook b8, just winning the queen. And queen versus rook and knight is going to be too much. So that's not enough. So the king went to h7, which is correct. And now rook b8 was played, and it looks like white is basically about to win. Rook h8 or queen h8 is mate if you move that queen off of the back rank, and it seems like there's nothing you could do. But there is. And after rook c1 check, king h2, I would like you to pause the video if you haven't seen this already and think for, let's say, 5 to 10 seconds, maybe longer, about what black could do to save this game, because it's spectacular. So I don't have a cup of tea today, but I'll just wait a moment for you to think on it. Okay, so incredibly, Vaishali played the only move that is enough to save the game. And if you look at the broadcast, Divya knew at this moment that there was a move that was possible to be played here. She knew she wasn't winning. She could see it, but there's too late because queen takes h3. A bolt from the blue saves the game. The point being that the king can't take an h3, knight's protecting. And after g takes h3, knight f3 check, recoups the queen. And miraculously, after king g2, knight takes e5, d takes e5, not only did you manage to get out of the checkmating net, you got the queen back. Now the material is equal. I mean, what a dream! What a save! Understandably, there's just shock when something like this happens, disappointment, because you think you're about to win and you didn't. And after rook a1, there was just one more move played, rook a8. And in this position after rook a8, Divya offered a draw, which Vaishali accepted. And wow, that was the game. Now, why is this a draw? Well, first of all, it's a rook endgame. The pawns are even. And this c6 pawn is pretty weak. And as soon as, essentially white attacks this pawn, let's say it's rook c8, black will take on a4. There'll be an exchange here. And this is going to peter out pretty quickly. Essentially, these pawns will probably get traded. This pawn might be traded for this one. This one might be traded for this one. And you're just going to have equal pawns on the same side of the board. That's a draw. Incredible save by Vaishali. The last game we're going to look at is a position between Zhu Jinner and Katerina Lacno. And Zhu actually played the French as well in this round. We saw Prague play the French in this round, and Zhu went for the French as well. Lacno went for a pawn sacrifice early on. I'm not going to show it. It didn't really go very well. And you look at this position, and black is better because black is a pawn up, clear pawn up. There's 6 pawns for black, 5 pawns for white, and has essentially a very, stable position. Now, one of the things that happens when you have a good position is that you sometimes try to be a maximalist. And what that means is you spend time trying to find the best moves, because if you find the best moves, you're going to have really good chances to win from the good position. The issue sometimes is, again, that time factor. So right now, white has a little bit more development, no doubt about it, really because white is castled and black isn't. This king is in the center. It's pretty safe right now because of this cocoon of pawns and the bishops here. But, that could change quickly. And in this position, sometimes the best move sometimes is a move that causes you to, basically take more time, but also assume more risk. And so Zhu actually played the best move in this position, but it actually cost her about 10-ish minutes to make, 10 to 15 minutes, and we're actually on move 18, and she needs to make it to move 40 to get extra time. And so the move that kind of is safer but not the best move is castles. And what it does is it gets your king out the center. You still have the extra pawn. You can centralize your rooks, maybe rook fd8, maybe bishop f6 in the future, maybe sometimes even king h8, rook g8 might be a thing. And you just have a great position. What she played, and the other thing is you could play it in a minute, because it's clearly a good thing to get your king safe. In this position, though, she played the best move, and she must be credited with playing the best move, knight d4. Incredible move, really because of the follow-up, which is this knight is hitting the pawn f3. The g pawn is pinned, and so the queen must remain attached to defending the f3 pawn. After the queen moved, knight takes f3 was a brilliant tactic. And the point is that after queen takes f3, which is forced because there's a fork here and you can't recapture the g pawn, now there's queen d4 check. And after queen d4 check, the bishop is hanging. So now after king h1, queen takes d4, you're actually 2 pawns up with the bishop pair. What's not to like? And plus, this b7 pawn, which looks hanging, is actually totally poisoned, because if you play queen takes b7, bishop c6 defends the rook on a8 and trains that bishop against the pawn g2. And after the queen moves, rook g8, this will be over shortly. Because this bishop and rook train against this g2 pawn means that even though this king on e8 is in the center, this king is actually the far weaker king now with an open board and the bishop pair. Now, queen takes b7 was not played, but the issue presently is that after white's move queen g3, white is actually down 2 pawns now, but this king can't castle. It can't castle right now to g8, clearly, because the queen is there. And castling to c8 is not good, because the c file is a totally open file, and this bishop on f4 is covering the b8 square, so you can't even get out of the center if you castle anyway. So the point is that black is 2 pawns up. This was the best continuation, but you're lower on time, and it's just hard to practically get your king safe now. And this happens from time to time, where the best line is not actually the ideal human line. So anyway, bishop c6 was played. That's a good move. You could get the bishop to this diagonal anyway. Rook a d1 was played, again centralizing. The best chance Lochno has is the pieces being super active. Bishop f6 now, reasonable move to covering the g7 squares. There's no queen g7 entrance. h3, h5, trying to actually kick the queen away from the king side. Very interesting. From the king side. Now after h4, the queen would have no squares on the g file, so maybe the king can shuttle over that way. h4 was played. Rook d8, excellent move, trying to trade rooks here. But now here's the problem. In just a few moves, right, we just went from that position with that computer play with queen d4 check, bishop c6. Now Zhu has 2 minutes on her clock. Not easy. 2 minutes for about 15 moves. Bishop g5 was played. Bishop takes g5. Queen takes g5. And now the mistake came. And the mistake here, again, understandable given the time trouble, was rook c8. Now, what you actually want to do, and it's very counterintuitive, is first you actually want to take on d1. And after it takes on d1, you want to go king f8. Ooh, king f8. You're just allowing rook d8 check? Well, you are. And the point is, after rook d8 check, bishop e8. That is awkward stuff. There's no more checks that kill you. And this knight on c3 actually can't get involved in the attack. There's no squares anywhere, really, where the knight can start jumping. And there just is shockingly not enough here. The queen has nowhere to enter either. If queen f6, well, rook g8 is actually good enough. And if you check the king again, the king can actually run to e7. And queen f1 check is there as well. So, shockingly, you can win. This is a winning position, but navigating this with 2 minutes on the clock is not easy. And so instead of rook takes d1, rook c8 was played. Kind of natural. Worried about this other rook getting active here. But you can see, yeah, white is 2 pawns down, but look at these dark squares. This is Swiss cheese if I've ever seen it. There's zero coverage for black on the dark squares. So white actually has a really nice tactic here to save the game. It was not found in this moment, but knight b5 is actually shockingly very strong. And the point is that if the queen is distracted from the e6 square, you can actually sacrifice. So queen takes b5 fails to rook takes e6. And after takes, there's queen g6 check. And there's just a perpetual, even queen takes f8. You can actually even take the rook here. But the point is there's a perpetual because the king can't get out of get onto the d file. And actually, if white takes on c8, which is possible, there's a counter perpetual with bishop takes g2, and actually king takes is wrong. King g1 is better, but after bishop d5, this is a drawn position because essentially white can give a lot of checks, and you have to give a lot of checks because if you don't, the queen will enter and there will be checkmate. But white can give enough checks to hold it together. So really weird line, knight b5, but a nice way to save the game. Instead, Lochno had played rook d2, and now there's chance number 2 or 3 for Zhu to actually win this game. And again, the best move is super hard to play when you have essentially 30 seconds left for 12 moves. Not great. But the best move here is actually queen g4. And the point is you're trying to smoke out the black queen on g5. If the queen moves back, then black can castle. What must have been hard in time trouble to appreciate is that after queen f6, hitting this rook, you can still castle. Yes, the queen is no longer on the g-file. You can protect that rook and castle, and now you're totally winning because there's no checks that kill you. There's only queen g5 check, and that would trade queens. So there are no checks that kill you. You're 2 pawns up. The knight can't enter the fray. The rooks are finally connected. The bishop is on the long diagonal. This is a totally winning position. But unfortunately, instead of playing queen g4, Zhu played queen b4, which is logical. The point being is she's saying, you know what, I want to get my queen back to e7 to challenge the, that's a bad arrow, but to challenge the queen on g5 and get some coverage on the dark squares. But unfortunately, it's too little too late because Lochno did not miss her chance now. Rook takes e6 is a dead draw on the spot because after f takes e6, you have to accept it. Queen g6 check, you have this repetition, and there's no way the king can escape the checks. If the king goes to e8, you're actually really asking for it because queen takes e6 is check and the rook on c8 is hanging. And if you go back to g8, you have this repetition. So remarkably, there were a few chances for black to actually get the kings safe. The last one being, instead of queen b4, queen g4, queen f6, and castles. And that probably would have been one of the furthest moves from the beginning of the game where she castled on, because that would have been castling on move 29. Who castles that late in the game? I've actually castled in the game on move, I think, 33 or something, but that's super rare. And so it's hard. It was hard to see, hard to appreciate that the rook was hanging. You could castle. Is it even a legal move? Yes, you can castle if your rook is being attacked. It's when your king is being attacked you can't castle. So if your rook is in check, so to speak, you can castle. If your king is in check, you cannot. So really interesting bit there, and that was the chance. Bottom line to me, though, is you have a great position. You're a pawn up, clearly, and you could connect your rooks right away and get your king safe in one move by castling here on move 18. And to be honest, the difference between castling, which is not the best move here, and what she played, which knight c4, which was the best move, is less than half a pawn. They're both positions that are -1. They're both really good, and I truly believe that if Zhu castled here, she would have won this game, because she still would have had an 8-minute advantage in this position. Her moves would have been way easier. She could centralize her rooks, and and she would have kept that time advantage. So tough break for Zhu. She's played 2 really good games. You recall she had a really awesome piece sacrifice in round 1 and didn't win that one either. So I think she's been showing the best form so far, but she's got to put away these games with wins. So anyway, that wraps up round 2 of the Fide 2026 candidates tournament in the open and the women's section. Tomorrow is round 3. Everyone did a lot of painting and drawing, and Joel Embiiding and Shai Gilgeous-Alexandering and Jalen Brunsoning. For these NBA people may know what I'm talking about. There was a lot of drawing stuff today, a lot of peace today, and sometimes we need that in the world, but not on the chessboard. So hopefully we'll get some more action tomorrow, and I'm sure we will, and I will see you then. Take care.